The man grabbed the little girl by the arm and dragged her up onto the platform like she weighed nothing, like she was a sack of feed. The child didn't scream, she didn't fight. She just went silent in that terrible way children go silent when they've already learned that screaming doesn't help. Her mother lunged forward, a woman heavy with child, 8 months along if she was a day. And a second man caught her by the shoulder and shoved her back. The crowd watched. Some of them looked away. Most didn't. That little girl stood on that wooden platform in Dry Creek, Colorado, in the autumn of 1887, and not one soul in that town moved to stop it. Not yet. If you'd been standing in that crowd that morning, would you have walked away? Or would you have done the one thing nobody else was willing to do? If stories like this speak to something deep in you, the kind of stories about ordinary people who find the courage to do extraordinary things, then subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. We release new stories every week, and we'd hate for you to miss a single one. Drop a comment below and tell us what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. It costs you nothing and means everything to us. Now, let's go back to that platform, because what happened next changed 4 lives forever and shocked an entire territory. Silas Boone hadn't planned on stopping in Dry Creek. He hadn't planned on much of anything that morning, which was about normal for him. He'd woken before dawn in his bedroll, eaten cold biscuits left over from 2 nights before, and climbed back onto his wagon with the singular goal of getting his wheel to a decent blacksmith before the crack in the wood split all the way through and dropped him axle deep in mud. Drake had a blacksmith. That was the only reason he turned off the main trail. I was 41 years old, lean in the way men get lean when they work too hard and eat too little, with hands that had stopped being soft sometime around his 20th year and never went back. He had a face that people sometimes described as hard, though that wasn't quite right. It was more like a face that had decided a long time ago not to give too much away. He'd had reasons for that decision, good ones. The town appeared the way most frontier towns appeared, grudgingly, like it hadn't wanted to be built there in the first place, but didn't have much say in the matter. 2 rows of buildings facing each other across a dirt street wide enough for wagons to pass. A saloon, a general store, a church with a roof that needed patching, a livery stable that smelled the way livery stables smell. And in the middle of the main street, a crowd. Silas pulled his wagon to a stop near the blacksmith shop and climbed down carefully, keeping his bad knee from buckling the way it liked to do when he'd been sitting too long. He could hear the crowd before he could see what it was gathered around. Not cheering exactly, more like the particular noise a group of people makes when they've gathered to watch something they know is wrong but can't quite stop watching anyway. He walked toward it because he wanted to see what the commotion was before he went about his business. That was all. He wasn't looking for trouble. He hadn't been looking for trouble in years. What he found stopped him cold. The platform was nothing more than a flatbed wagon with the sides taken off, maybe 3 feet off the ground. A man Silas didn't know, thick-necked, wearing a vest that had been expensive once, stood at the front of it like he was conducting an auction at a livestock fair. Because that was what it was. That was exactly what it was. On the platform stood a woman and a child. The woman was pregnant. Not a little pregnant, visibly, undeniably, cannot be ignored pregnant, the kind where every movement costs something. She was wearing a gray dress that had been mended so many times the mending had become part of the fabric. Her hair was dark and pinned back with what looked like a single wooden pin, and she was holding the little girl's hand with both of hers, like she was the only solid thing left in the world. The child was maybe 6 or 7, small for her age or maybe just compressed by circumstance. She had her mother's dark hair and her mother's expression, which was to say the expression of someone who has learned to make themselves as small and invisible as possible in hopes that the bad thing will choose someone else. Widow woman, good health, capable of work, carrying a child that'll be born in a matter of weeks, the man in the vest was saying, in the tone of someone listing the features of a draft horse. Comes with the girl, who's quiet as you'd want. Now who's going to start us at 20? I heard she's trouble, a man near Silas said to nobody in particular. Heard she ran off from her husband's family, said another. Mercer family up north. You know the Mercers? The first man shook his head. Well, I do, the second man said. And if the Mercers want her back, I ain't touching that with a 40-foot pole. Silas stood there and watched the woman on the platform look out at the crowd, and he watched the moment she stopped looking for help. It happened right in front of him. Her eyes moved across the gathered faces one by one, and somewhere in the middle of that sweep, something shifted in them. Not despair exactly. Something quieter than despair. Something more like the acceptance that comes after despair has already done its work. The little girl turned and looked directly at Silas. He didn't know why. There were 50 people in that crowd. But the child looked at him, and her expression didn't change, and she looked away again. Something moved in his chest that he had no name for and didn't want one. 15. Someone called out from the crowd in the bored tone of a man making an offer he expected to be outbid on. 15. I have 15. $15, Silas said out loud to himself in something like disbelief. The man next to him glanced over. That's about what they'll get for her, I'd wager. Nobody wants the trouble. She's a person, Silas said. The man blinked at him. Well, he said carefully, technically. Silas had a total of $63 in his coat pocket. 40 of that was earmarked for repairs and winter supplies. He'd been stretching it thin for 2 months, and there wasn't more coming until he sold off the cattle in spring. 20, he heard himself say. The auctioneer pointed at him immediately. 20 from the gentleman in the back. The woman on the platform turned toward the sound of his voice. She found him in the crowd, and he could see her trying to read him the same way he'd watched her read everyone else, looking for the thing behind the thing, looking for what kind of trouble he was going to be. He wasn't sure what she saw. He wasn't sure what was there to see. 25, said the bored man who'd opened at 15, with the tone of someone who'd decided to be contrary. 30, Silas said. He was aware of people looking at him now. He didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the platform. 35, the other man said, slightly less bored now. Silas thought about $40 in winter and the roof on the east side of the barn that was going to need work. He thought about $63 total and how far that didn't go. 50, he said. The crowd went quiet. The bored man said nothing. $50, the auctioneer said, looking at Silas with an expression that was either impressed or suspicious, and might have been both. Do I hear 55? Nobody said anything. Sold, the auctioneer said, pointing at Silas, to the man in the back. The woman on the platform closed her eyes for just a moment, just one moment. Then she opened them again and stood up straighter, and Silas thought that whatever she'd decided about him in those few seconds, she'd decided to wait and see. The little girl was still looking at the ground. Silas pushed through the crowd to pay the auctioneer, who took his money with the practiced efficiency of a man who didn't want to think too hard about what he was doing. Silas didn't shake his hand. He took the paper the man offered, a paper he didn't want, and that turned his stomach. And he folded it and put it in his pocket because he thought maybe it was better to have it than not, legal-wise. When he reached the platform, the woman was already climbing down by herself, one hand braced against the wagon's sideboards, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone 8 months along who had learned not to ask for help because asking had stopped working. Silas reached up and offered his arm anyway. She looked at his arm, then at his face. Then she took his arm. Just briefly, just for the last 2 steps down. I'm Silas Boone, he said. Evelyn Mercer, she said. Her voice was steadier than he expected. This is my daughter Hazel. He looked down at the child. The child looked at his boots. Hello, Hazel, he said. Hazel said nothing. She moved closer to her mother's side. She doesn't talk much, Evelyn said, in the tone of someone who'd explained this many times and was braced for the judgment that usually followed. That's all right, Silas said. I don't either. He wasn't trying to be charming. He was just saying the truth. Evelyn looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't read, and then she looked away. I have a wagon, Silas said, and I need to get my wheels seen to before we go anywhere. If you'll wait by the smithy, I'll be as fast as I can manage. Where are you taking us? She asked. Not accusingly, practically. I have a ranch, he said, about 9 miles northeast. You'd be safe there. He paused. You don't have to come. I'm not... He stopped because he didn't know quite how to say what he was trying to say. I'm not going to make you do anything. You need somewhere to go, and I have somewhere. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Around them, the crowd was dispersing, people drifting back to their business with the particular relief of people who'd watched something uncomfortable and were glad it was over. "We'll wait by the smithy," she said. He nodded and turned to go, and he'd taken maybe 4 steps when he heard a voice behind him. Sharp, carrying, meant to be heard. "You know who she's running from, friend?" He stopped. He turned around. The man was heavy-set, older than Silas by a decade, wearing a coat that cost more than anything Silas owned. He was standing at the edge of the dispersing crowd with 2 other men flanking him, and he was looking at Silas with the expression of a man who is very used to being the largest obstacle in any given situation. "I don't believe I was talking to you," Silas said. "Name's Harold Fitch," the man said. "I represent certain interests in this territory, and one of those interests relates directly to that woman." He nodded toward Evelyn. "She's expected back north. There are people who have a claim." "She has a paper," Silas said. "Paid and legal." Fitch smiled. It wasn't a good smile. "Papers can be complicated," he said. "I'd think carefully before you make this your business." Silas looked at him for a long moment. "Already did," he said, and turned around and walked to the smithy. He stood at the smith's workbench while the man assessed the wheel, and he did the arithmetic in his head that he'd been avoiding since the moment he'd opened his mouth in that crowd. He had $13 left. $13 for a wheel repair that was going to cost at least $8, plus winter supplies he'd been rationing toward for 2 months. He'd just done a foolish thing. He knew it. He'd spent money he couldn't spare on 2 strangers he knew nothing about, in a town he'd been passing through, for no reason except that a little girl had looked at him from a wooden platform, and something in him had refused to stand still. He wasn't a hero. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. He'd done plenty of things in his life he wasn't proud of. He'd been angry and selfish and absent when he should have been present, and he'd learned the cost of all of it. What he'd done this morning wasn't bravery. It was closer to a reflex. The same kind of reflex that makes you catch a glass before it hits the floor. Not because you planned to, but because your hand moved before your brain decided anything. The smith came back with a number. It was $9. Silas paid it. He had $4 left. By the time the wheel was repaired and he brought the wagon around to the smithy, Evelyn and Hazel were standing exactly where he'd told them to wait. Evelyn had Hazel's hand. Hazel had her eyes on the ground. Neither of them had moved. It occurred to him that they'd probably stood like that, completely still and completely silent, for the entire 40 minutes he'd been at the Smiths. It was the stillness of people who'd learned that moving drew attention. "Ready?" he said. Evelyn nodded. She was already assessing the wagon, the height of it, the climb required. Without being asked, Silas stepped around to the side and offered his hand again. She took it this time without looking at him. She climbed up slowly, carefully, getting settled on the bench with the painstaking caution of someone for whom every position had become a negotiation. Silas reached down for Hazel. The child flinched back. Not much, just a fraction. But he saw it. He went still immediately and let his hand drop and crouched down instead so he was at her level. "You can climb up yourself if you want," he said. "I won't touch you if you don't want." Hazel looked at him, for the first time, straight at his face. Her eyes were dark, like her mother's, and there was something in them that was too old for her face. Not fear exactly. It was more like wariness, the kind that comes from having been afraid for so long that it just becomes the baseline state of being. She looked at him for about 5 seconds. Then she reached out and grabbed the wagon wheel spoke and hoisted herself up, pulling with the determined strength of a child who'd learned that depending on adults was a variable you couldn't always count on. She made it to the bench next to her mother and sat down without looking at him again. Silas straightened up and climbed up on the other side and took the reins. They pulled out of Dry Creek in silence. He didn't try to fill it. He was not a man who filled silence for the sake of filling it. He drove, and the horses moved, and behind them the town of Dry Creek got smaller and then disappeared around a rise. And Silas felt something loosen in his shoulders that he hadn't realized was tight. He glanced sideways at Evelyn. She was looking straight ahead, one hand resting on her belly with the unconscious habitual tenderness that pregnant women develop without noticing they've developed it. "You didn't have to do that," she said without looking at him. "Seemed like somebody should," he said. A pause. "That man," she said. "Fitch, you know what he told you is going to get back to someone." "I figured," Silas said, "that someone isn't going to be happy." "I figured that too." Evelyn turned and looked at him. She had a way of looking at people that was very direct, the way people get direct when they've run out of time for indirection. The person he's working for, she said carefully, is my late husband's brother. His name is Gideon Mercer. He has money. He has connections in the territory, and he believes... She stopped, swallowed. He believes that when my husband died, I became his responsibility, his property. He's been chasing us for 3 months. Silas drove. All right, he said. She stared at him. That's all you have to say? All right. What would you like me to say? I'd like you to understand what you've gotten yourself into, she said, and her voice had gone tight with something that wasn't anger, something closer to desperation. I'm not... She stopped again, started over. I am not an easy rescue, Mr. Boone. I have a child who doesn't speak and a baby coming in 6 weeks and a powerful man hunting me across the territory. I am the opposite of easy. I didn't ask for easy, Silas said. She kept staring at him. He kept his eyes on the trail. From beside her mother, so quiet that Silas almost missed it, came the smallest sound. Not quite a word. Just a sound. Like the first letter of a sound, the breath before a sound that stopped itself before it could become real. He didn't look over. He didn't react. He just kept driving, and he let the silence be what it was, and after a while the mountains came into view ahead of them, white at the tops and dark green below, and he turned the wagon northeast toward the valley where he'd spent the last 7 years alone. He didn't know then what he was driving toward. He thought he was just driving home. He didn't know home was what he'd already left to go somewhere else. The wind came down off the peaks, and the wagon wheels turned, and somewhere in the hills behind them, Silas Boone understood with a certainty he couldn't explain that Harold Fitch was already finding a way to send word north. And somewhere to the north, a man named Gideon Mercer was going to hear about it. The ranch appeared around a bend in the trail like something that had grown there rather than been built. A low cabin of dark timber, a barn that leaned slightly to the left as if it had been leaning that way for so long it had forgotten how to stand straight, 2 corrals made of posts and wire, and beyond all of it, the mountains filling the entire northern horizon like a wall the world had put up to say this is as far as things go. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin and set the brake and climbed down. He stood there for a moment looking at it the way a man looks at something he sees every day and has mostly stopped seeing, and then he looked at it the way he imagined Evelyn was seeing it. The sagging porch step, the window on the east side with the crack in it he'd been meaning to fix since March, the general aspect of a place that had been maintained by one person doing the work of 3 and not quite keeping up. It's not much, he said. Evelyn was already studying it with that direct, assessing look she had. It has a roof, she said. Mostly. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. He helped her down. She took his arm without hesitating this time, which he noticed, and Hazel climbed down on her own again, same as before, using the wheel spoke, dropping the last foot to the ground and landing in a crouch like a small animal that had learned to land quietly. She straightened up and stood close to her mother and looked at the cabin with an expression that gave nothing away. Silas opened the cabin door and stood back to let them in first. The inside was what the outside promised. One main room that served as kitchen and sitting area, a table with 2 chairs, an iron stove that worked well even if it didn't look like much, shelves with provisions, a narrow doorway leading to the back room where he slept. He'd made the bed that morning out of habit, which was the only thing he could think of now to be grateful for. He kept the place clean in the way that men who live alone keep things clean, functional rather than comfortable, everything in its place because there was nobody else to move it. The back room is yours, he said. I'll sleep out here. Evelyn turned around. Mr. Boone? Silas. Silas. She paused like she was trying the name out to see if it fit. We cannot take your bed. It's the only room with a door, he said. And you need a door. I'll be fine on the floor. I've slept on worse. She looked at him for a moment with the expression she'd been giving him since Dry Creek, the one that seemed to be trying to locate the angle he was working from. There's no angle, he said, before he knew he was going to say it. She blinked. What? You keep looking at me like you're waiting for the part where I tell you what this costs you, he said. There's no part like that. You're here because you needed somewhere to be, and I had somewhere. That's the whole of it. A long silence. People don't generally work that way, she said quietly. I know, he said. He left them to settle in and went out to the barn to see to the horses, because the horses needed seeing to, and because he thought she probably needed 10 minutes without someone looking at her. He'd learned something about people in his 41 years, which was that the moment after a crisis was sometimes harder than the crisis itself. The moment when the thing you'd been bracing against stopped coming and you had to figure out how to just stand upright on your own again. He was brushing down the second horse when he heard the creak of the barn door. He didn't turn around. He knew it wasn't Evelyn. Her footsteps had a particular careful weight to them, the weight of someone redistributing their center of gravity around a pregnancy. These footsteps were lighter, almost nothing. He kept brushing the horse and said, "You can come in if you want." Silence. He turned around slowly. Hazel was standing in the barn doorway, one hand on the doorframe, looking at the horses with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not the closed-off wariness she'd worn since he first saw her on that platform. Something else. Something younger than 7 and more honest than anything she'd let him see yet. "She won't bite," Silas said, nodding at the horse. "Her name's May. The other one's called Cooper. He might bite, but only if you put your fingers near his mouth, which I'd recommend not doing." Hazel looked at May. "You can pet her if you want," Silas said. "Just come up slow on the left side so she can see you coming. Horses don't like surprises." He went back to brushing Cooper, the one who might bite, on the right side, facing away, and he listened to the sound of small feet moving carefully across the barn floor. A pause. Then the soft sound of a child's hand on a horse's neck. May made a low sound that was as close to contentment as horses got. Silas kept brushing and didn't say anything and didn't look, because he understood without having thought it through that this was not a moment that could survive being noticed. He slept on the floor that night with a blanket from the chest and his coat rolled under his head, and he lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the cabin that were different now. The soft movements from behind the closed door, the creak of the bed settling under different weight. And he thought about Harold Fitch and what he'd said, and about the name Gideon Mercer that Evelyn had said with a particular quality in her voice. The quality of a name you don't say out loud unless you have to, because saying it makes it more real. He thought about the $4 in his pocket. He thought about the fact that he'd just promised 2 strangers and an unborn baby that nobody was going to make them leave. He'd meant it when he said it. He just hadn't thought through all the ways that promise could get complicated. Sleep came eventually, the way it did when you were tired enough, which he was. The first week passed in a careful dance of 2 people trying to take up as little space as possible so as not to impose on each other. Evelyn was up before him every morning. He'd come in from the early chores to find the stove going and something on it. Not fancy. She was working with what he had, which wasn't much. But she had the kind of practical knowledge that could make a meal out of nearly nothing and make it taste like it was supposed to be there. The first time she'd done it, he'd walked in and stopped in the doorway, because the smell hit him in a way he hadn't been prepared for. It was just cornbread and salt pork. But the cabin had smelled like food cooking for the first time, and he didn't know how long, and something about it reached back past his defenses and grabbed him somewhere he hadn't expected to feel grabbed. He sat down and ate and said it was good, because it was. She said thank you and sat across from him with her own plate and didn't make a production out of any of it. Hazel ate next to her mother in that compressed, efficient way she did everything, and watched Silas with sidelong glances that she probably thought he didn't notice. He noticed. He didn't comment. He was learning that with Hazel, commenting on a thing was the surest way to make it stop happening. By the 4th day, Hazel had started going to the barn on her own. Silas found her there one afternoon, sitting on a hay bale, with May's head hanging over the stall door at Hazel's shoulder level, the horse's chin resting on the child's hair with the placid certainty of an animal that had decided this person was trustworthy. Hazel had her eyes closed. Her whole face was different when she thought no one was watching. Younger, softer, more like what a 7-year-old was supposed to look like. He backed out of the barn quietly and found something else to do on the other side of the property. On the 6th day, Evelyn found him replacing the broken porch step. He'd finally gotten to it. And she sat down on the edge of the porch and watched him work, and after a while said, "I need to tell you some things." He kept working. "All right." She was quiet for a moment in the way of someone ordering their thoughts carefully, figuring out where to start. He'd learned in 6 days that she did this, that she didn't speak until she knew what she wanted to say, which was rarer than people realized, and generally meant that when she did speak, It was worth listening to. My husband was named Thomas Mercer, she said. He was the younger of two brothers. His family has land up in the north part of the territory, near a settlement called Harrow's Bluff. They've been there for a long time. They have money and they have influence is the word people use. What they actually have is a long memory and a habit of getting what they want. Silas fitted the new board and drove the first nail. Thomas wasn't like his brother, she said, and the past tense landed with a weight she didn't try to cushion. He was a decent man. We had 5 years. They weren't easy years. Things were hard in ways they're hard for most people out here. But he was decent, and he was trying. A pause. He got sick in January. Fever. He was gone in 10 days. I'm sorry, Silas said. By February, Gideon had started coming around. She said his name the way you say the name of something you've decided to look at directly because looking away doesn't make it go away. At first he said it was to help, to check on me. But Gideon doesn't check on people out of kindness. Everything Gideon does, he does because he's decided he's entitled to it. She stopped, started again. He told me in March that I was going to come live at the main Mercer house, that it was appropriate, that the baby, Thomas's baby, was a Mercer child and would be raised as one, under his roof, under his authority. What did you say? Silas asked. I said no. He drove the second nail. And then, he said. And then things got unpleasant, she said. He started telling people in the settlement that I was unstable, that I'd had some kind of episode, that I wasn't fit to be on my own. He has friends in most of the right places, so people believed him, or at least they stopped pushing back against him. Her voice was steady. Not entirely steady. There were places in it where the steadiness cost something, but mostly steady. He tried to have a judge declare me unfit in April. The judge ruled against him, but the judge is old and Gideon is patient. He tried again in May. By then, I understood that if I stayed in that territory, eventually he would find a way to win because he had more resources than I had and more time than I had. So you ran, Silas said. I ran, she said, without apology. I took Hazel and what I could carry, and I went south. I made it 3 settlements before I ran out of money, and someone who recognized me from Gideon's description told the local sheriff he'd heard there was a woman trying to pass through without proper documentation. She said proper documentation the way you say a phrase that makes you sick. The sheriff in Dry Creek decided the simplest way to resolve the situation was to auction us off as indentured workers until the matter of our status could be clarified. Proper documentation, Silas repeated. Apparently a widow woman traveling alone with a child and no male family member is a status problem in some jurisdictions, she said. I was not aware of how large a problem until I became one. Silas sat back on his heels and looked at the repaired step and then at her. Gideon Mercer, he said. He's going to know where you are. Yes, she said. Fitch will have sent word already. How long before he comes? She thought about it. He won't come immediately. That's not how he operates. He'll want to have his arguments prepared. He'll want to have a legal framework. He believes in doing things in ways that look correct from the outside. Her mouth went tight. He'll probably come with a letter from a lawyer first. And then if that doesn't work, he'll come with something else. Men, Silas said. Men, she confirmed. He stood up, tested the step. It held. Then we've got some time to figure out how to be ready, he said. She looked at him with that expression again, the one searching for the angle. I keep waiting for you to tell me I should go somewhere else, she said. That it's too complicated, that it's not your problem. It's my land, he said simply. Anybody who comes onto my land to make trouble for someone I said could be here, that's my problem by definition. Silas. She said his name differently than she had the first time. Something in it had changed, like a door that had been stuck and just shifted slightly on its hinge. I need you to understand what I'm asking you to get into. Gideon Mercer does not accept no. He does not accept being outmaneuvered. He will come at you from every direction he can find. I've had people come at me from directions before, he said. Not like him. He looked at her for a moment. Maybe not, he said honestly. But I've been on this land 7 years and I'm not planning on leaving it, and I don't generally let other people's plans supersede mine when it comes to what happens here. A long pause. Why? She said. And I mean the real reason, not the land. Why do you care what happens to us? He thought about it. He owed her a real answer, so he took the time to find one. I had a family, he said. Wife. A son. He paused. They died. 7 years ago. Fever. Same as your husband. Except I wasn't there. I was away. I was always away. I was the kind of man who told himself the work needed doing, and by the time I got back, he stopped. Started over. I don't have a better reason than that. I saw a woman and a child on a platform, and I thought about what it means when nobody moves, and I couldn't be one more person who didn't move. Evelyn was quiet for a long time. I'm sorry, she said. About your wife. Your son. It was a long time ago, he said, which was true in years and not true in the ways that mattered. She nodded like she understood the difference. All right, she said, and stood up slowly, one hand on the porch post for balance. Then I'll stay, and I'll do my part. I'm not a woman who doesn't do her part. I know that already, he said. Been watching you do it for 6 days. She looked at him sharply, then looked away, and went inside, and he heard her moving around in the kitchen, and he stood on the repaired porch step and thought about Gideon Mercer, a man he'd never met, who was somewhere to the north getting word right now about where Evelyn was. He thought about what Evelyn had said. He does things in ways that look correct from the outside. That was the dangerous kind. The kind that came at you with lawyers and papers and good reasons, the kind that had thought through the argument before you knew there was going to be one. 2 weeks passed. 3. The ranch settled into a routine that had never been its routine before, noisier in small ways, warmer in ways that had nothing to do with the stove. Evelyn had started making small changes to the cabin with such practical matter-of-factness that he only noticed them after they'd happened. A piece of cloth over the cracked window that cut the draft. His provisions reorganized on the shelves in a way that actually made sense. The 2 chairs at the table joined by a crate that served as a third seat for Hazel, who had started sitting slightly less like she was prepared to run. He'd started leaving Hazel small things. Not gifts exactly, just things that appeared near where she sat. A smooth river rock, an interesting piece of wood, once a feather he'd found that was from a species he didn't recognize, iridescent blue at the edges. He never pointed them out. He just left them and went about his business. One morning he came in from the barn to find all the rocks and the piece of wood arranged in a precise line on the windowsill, ordered from smallest to largest, with the feather propped at the end. He sat down for breakfast and didn't say a word about it. But when he glanced up from his plate, Hazel was watching him with dark eyes that were waiting to see what he'd do with the fact of it. He held her gaze for a second and gave a small nod, as if she'd asked a question and he was confirming the answer was yes. She looked back at her food, but the set of her shoulders changed by maybe 2 degrees, and it was the most significant 2 degrees he'd seen in weeks. He was 3 miles from the ranch, checking the eastern fence line, when he saw the riders. 2 of them, sitting still on a ridge about half a mile north, watching the property. He'd been walking the fence with his head down, and when he looked up, they were just there, not moving, not approaching, just observing with the kind of patience that told him they'd been there a while before he spotted them. He stood still and looked at them. They looked at him. After about 30 seconds, one of them turned his horse, and they rode back north along the ridge and disappeared over the crest. He finished checking the fence and walked back to the ranch, and went inside and told Evelyn. She went very still when he said it, not frightened exactly, more like the stillness of someone who had been expecting a particular kind of news and had just received it. He's mapping the property, she said. That's what I thought, Silas said. That means he's close, she said, or his people are. Have to assume so. She sat down at the table. Her hands were in her lap and she was looking at the middle distance the way she looked at something she was thinking through. Then she said, There's something you need to know. I didn't tell you before because I wasn't sure how much it mattered, but it matters now. Tell me, he said. Gideon's claim on me, or the claim he believes he has. It's partly legal in the sense that there's a document. Thomas signed something with his brother before we were married, a family agreement, the kind of thing families do out here when they're trying to keep land and assets together. The document says that in the event of Thomas's death, it uses the word assets. Assets and dependents revert to the elder Mercer. Silas looked at her. He has a document that calls you an asset. Yes. Does it hold up legally? His lawyer says yes. Another lawyer I spoke to in March said probably not, but that it would take time and money to fight, and the outcome wasn't certain. She paused. Time and money I didn't have. He pulled the other chair out and sat down across from her. Do you have the document? A copy? I have Thomas's copy. I took it when I left. I didn't know if it would help me or hurt me, but I knew I wanted it where Gideon couldn't have it. Good, Silas said. That was smart. She looked at him. There's something else. She said it in the way that told him this was the thing she'd been working up to. The document has a clause. It says the provision is void if the widow remarries. The room was very quiet. Silas could hear the wind outside picking up, moving down from the peaks the way it did in October when winter was starting to test the air. All right, he said. I'm not... She stopped. I'm not saying that. I'm just telling you it exists, the clause. I'm not asking you for anything. I know you're not, he said. The silence stretched between them, not entirely comfortable, but not the silence of two strangers either. Something else. The silence of two people who had too much to think about and not enough time to think about it carefully. Go rest, he said. You look tired. I'm always tired, she said, but she stood up and she went to the back room and he heard the door close. He sat at the table for a while after she went in. Outside, the wind pushed at the walls, and somewhere up on the ridge where those two riders had been, a hawk called once and then went quiet. He thought about a document that called a woman an asset. He thought about the clause that made it void. He wasn't thinking about himself when he thought about it. I was thinking about Hazel, who had started arranging rocks on a windowsill. He was thinking about the baby who was going to come in a matter of weeks into whatever situation existed at that moment. He was thinking about Evelyn's face when she'd said Gideon Mercer's name, not afraid precisely, but something that lived right next to afraid and had been living there for so long it had started to feel normal. He got up and went out to reinforce the latch on the barn door because it needed doing, and because doing something with his hands was how he thought. The fire came on a Wednesday. He woke to the smell of it before he heard anything. That particular sharpness of wood burning when wood isn't supposed to be burning, different from the stove, coming from the wrong direction. He was on his feet before he was fully awake, moving toward the door, and then he heard it. The low crackling roar of something that had already gotten larger than it should have been allowed to get. The small hay shed on the west side of the property was fully engulfed. He was out the door and running before he'd thought about anything except the barn. If it spread to the barn, the horses would die and there was nothing to be done for them. The barn was too close. He was shouting for water, though there was no one to hear him shouting, and then he heard the cabin door and turned to see Evelyn standing on the porch. The barn, he yelled. Don't let it spread. Can you work a bucket line? Yes, she said, without hesitation. Hazel, stay inside. He didn't have time to think about whether it was right to let a pregnant woman help fight a fire, and it wouldn't have mattered if he did because she was already moving. They worked the well for 45 minutes, hauling water and throwing it not at the hay shed. That was gone. It had been gone before he woke up. But at the ground and the fence line and the wall of the barn closest to it, soaking everything they could reach, building a wet barrier between the fire and what mattered. It worked. The shed burned to the ground. The barn didn't catch. When it was finally down to embers and there was nothing left to fight, he stood in the mud and smoke and looked at what was left of the shed and breathed. His hands were burned along the palm where he'd grabbed a fence post that had been too hot. Not bad burns, functional, but they were going to hurt tomorrow. Evelyn was standing 10 feet away, her dress soaked and her hair half down, and her face gray with ash and exhaustion. She was also 8 months pregnant and had just spent 45 minutes hauling buckets of water, and he was suddenly, acutely aware of that, in a way he should have been more aware of while it was happening. You should sit down, he said. I'm fine, she said. Evelyn. I said I'm fine. But she put her hand against the barn wall just briefly, and he could see her breathe through something, a contraction or just exhaustion, before it passed. The baby's all right. I know the difference. He looked at her and didn't argue, because she was the authority on that question. That wasn't an accident, he said. No, she said. It wasn't. She was looking at the embers. Her face in the orange light was very still, and what he saw in it wasn't fear. It had gone past fear. Maybe it had always been past fear. It was the expression of someone who has been fighting a very long time and has just had proof that the fight is going to keep going. He's telling us he can reach us, she said. Yes, Silas said. And he's not coming himself. Not yet. He's sending a message first. That's consistent with what you said. Does it in ways that look correct? She turned and looked at him. Burning someone's outbuilding in the middle of the night doesn't look correct. No, Silas said. But if nothing can be proven, it doesn't need to look correct. It just needs to work. She looked at him for a long moment. He expected this to frighten us into moving, she said. Did it? She almost laughed. It wasn't a happy sound, but it was real. I've been frightened for 8 months, Silas. I'm tired of making decisions based on it. He nodded. Then we stay, he said, and we figure out the next move. She pushed off from the barn wall and straightened up to her full height, which wasn't much but was considerable in the way she held it. I need to check on Hazel, she said. He watched her walk back to the cabin, slowly, carefully, one hand hovering near her belly. And he turned back to the smoldering ruins of the shed and looked at them for a long time in the gray pre-dawn light. The message had been sent. He understood it clearly. What Gideon Mercer didn't understand yet, what he was going to have to find out the way some men only learn things, which was by running into them directly, was that Silas Boone had spent 7 years alone on this land and had nothing left in his life that he was willing to lose. That made a man considerably harder to frighten than Gideon had probably calculated. Inside the cabin, he could see lamplight moving through the window and the shadow of Evelyn moving with it, and then the smaller shadow of Hazel, up out of bed and going to her mother, and the two shapes coming together the way they always did. The child folding into the woman's arm coming around her, both of them still, just holding on. He stood in the dark and the smoke and looked at that lit window for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he went to check on the horses, because someone had to. The morning after the fire, Silas's hands hurt enough that he had trouble gripping the coffee cup. He didn't mention it. Evelyn noticed anyway. She noticed most things, he'd come to understand. She just chose carefully which ones to act on. And she came around the table and looked at his palms without asking permission and made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine. You have blisters the size of quarters on both hands and you're trying to hold a cup by the handle with your fingertips," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. She went to the shelf where he kept the few medical supplies he had, carbolic, some linen strips, a tin of salve that was nearly empty. And she came back and sat across from him and took his right hand in both of hers with the matter-of-fact firmness of a woman who had done this kind of thing before and was not going to make it more than it was. He watched her work and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and because the alternative was to notice how long it had been since another person had touched his hands for any reason, which was a thought he didn't particularly want to finish. "You should have said something last night," she said. "There were other things to deal with last night." "There are always other things to deal with." She wrapped the linen around his palm with practiced efficiency. "That doesn't mean you get to pretend you're not hurt." He watched the top of her head as she worked. A strand of dark hair had come loose from the pin again. It was always the same strand, the one at the left temple. And she'd stopped trying to fix it somewhere around the second week, he'd noticed. "I've been pretending I'm not hurt for about 7 years, he said. "I'm reasonably good at it by now." She paused in her wrapping and looked up at him. It was a brief look, but it landed fully. "I know," she said. And then she went back to the bandaging without making anything more of it, which was exactly right, and which he was more grateful for than he could have explained. From the back room came the sound of Hazel stirring, the particular sound of small feet hitting a floor, and then the silence of a child standing still, listening, figuring out what kind of morning it was before committing to it. Evelyn turned her head slightly toward the sound. Something in her face shifted. Not worry, but attention. That particular focused attention mothers had, that was different from any other kind of attention he'd seen. "She knows something happened," Evelyn said quietly. "She always knows." "What do you tell her?" "The truth," she said. "Simplify, but the truth." Children who've been kept in the dark about things learn to fill in the dark with their own versions of what's there, and their versions are usually worse. The door to the back room opened and Hazel appeared in it, fully dressed, her hair in the slightly uneven braid that she'd started doing herself sometime in the past 2 weeks. She stood in the doorway and looked at Silas's bandaged hands, and then at her mother. "A shed caught fire," Evelyn said. "Outside. Silas burned his hands putting it out. Nobody is hurt, and the horses are fine." Hazel looked at Silas. He held up both bandaged hands slightly, A small gesture. Here they are. Nothing catastrophic. Hazel looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes that had gotten slightly less guarded over the weeks, but were still, fundamentally, the eyes of a child who had learned to read situations before she trusted them. Then she walked to the table, sat down, and waited for breakfast with the particular deliberate normalcy of a 7-year-old who had decided she was going to act normal, even if normal was a thing she was mostly working from theory. He almost said something. He didn't. 3 days after the fire, a letter arrived. Not through the post. There was a boy from the settlement 6 miles south, maybe 12 years old, who appeared at the gate on a horse too big for him and held out an envelope with the uncertain confidence of someone who'd been paid to deliver something and was hoping delivery was the last step required of him. Silas took it. The boy rode away immediately. He stood at the fence and looked at the envelope. It was good paper, the heavy cream-colored kind. His name was written on the front in a precise, slanted hand. Not Evelyn's name. His. He went inside and sat at the table and opened it. The letter was from an attorney named Caldwell Briggs, operating out of a town called Harrow's Bluff. It was 4 pages long and written in the dense, airless language that lawyers used when they wanted to say something simple in the most complicated way possible. But the simple thing it was saying was this: Gideon Mercer, as surviving patriarch of the Mercer family, held a legal instrument establishing his authority over the widow of Thomas Mercer and her dependents, including any child born of the marriage. That instrument was recognized under territorial family compact law. The widow was expected to present herself at the Mercer family residence within 20 days. Any individual currently harboring the widow against the interests of the Mercer family should understand that interference with a legally established family compact was a matter the territory's courts took seriously. The last paragraph said, in slightly more human language, Mr. Mercer is prepared to be reasonable if this matter is resolved promptly and without further complication. Silas read it twice. Then he walked to the back room and knocked on the door. "Come in," Evelyn said. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her back straight, her hands in her lap, and she was already looking at the letter in his hand with the expression of someone who has been expecting a particular envelope for weeks and is now doing the arithmetic of finally receiving it. He handed it to her. She read it. It took her longer than it had taken him, which he understood. She was reading the specific language the way you read something that affects your life, slowly, looking for the exact edges of each thing. When she finished, she set it on the bed beside her. 20 days, she said. Yes. He used a family compact instrument, she said. She paused. That's more formal than I expected. He's been building this. For how long? Probably since Thomas died. She was looking at the wall. Maybe before. Gideon thinks in longer timelines than most people. She was quiet for a moment. His strategy is to come at me with so many layers of legal structure that fighting any one of them is expensive and exhausting, and by the time I get through them, he's already filed the next one. He has the money and the connections to sustain that. I don't. What would happen if you went? Silas asked. Not because he thought she should, because he needed to understand what they were actually protecting her from. She turned and looked at him directly. He would take the baby when it was born, she said. He would keep Hazel too, as collateral, I suppose, is the honest word. And I would live in that house as something halfway between a ward and a prisoner, with the understanding that my children's welfare depended on my compliance. She said it very evenly, very flatly, the way you say a thing you've thought about so many times, it's lost the ability to surprise you. Gideon doesn't believe he's doing anything wrong. That's what makes him so difficult to reason with. He genuinely believes that women and children are things to be administered, not people to make choices, and that his administration is generous and therefore desirable. Silas sat down on the crate that had appeared in here at some point, pushed against the wall, one of those small rearrangements of the space that had happened so gradually he couldn't have said when. Tell me about the clause again, he said, the one in the family compact document. She looked at him. Silas, I'm not asking you to do anything, he said. I'm asking you to tell me exactly what it says. She was quiet for a moment. It says the compact provisions are rendered void if the widow enters into a legal marriage with another party within the territorial jurisdiction. With any party? The language doesn't specify. Any legal marriage would void it. He nodded slowly. The problem, she said carefully, is that voiding the compact doesn't stop Gideon. It stops the legal framework. He still has he has the kind of anger that doesn't require legal justification. He'd find another way. Let him find another way without the legal framework, Silas said. Right now he's got the law in front of him like a shield, and men with guns behind him. Take the law away from him and he's just a man with men and guns, and that's a different problem. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. You understand what you're saying, she said. It wasn't a question. I'm not a man who says things he doesn't understand, he said. You'd be taking on a pregnant woman and her child who doesn't speak, and a powerful enemy who has already burned part of your property, she said. Permanently. There's no... A marriage isn't a document you return when the trouble passes. I know what a marriage is, he said. It came out slightly harder than he meant it to. He softened it. I know it's not a small thing. I'm not asking you to pretend it is. I'm not asking you to pretend it is or to feel something you don't feel. I'm asking you whether it makes sense practically as a way to protect you and your children. She stood up. She walked to the window and stood there with her back to him, looking out at the yard, the mountains, the place where the shed had been and was now a black square of ash and charred wood. I have spent 8 months being protected by systems, she said, by the concept of what a decent person does, by the idea that the law works the way it's supposed to, by the hope that someone would eventually tell Gideon he didn't have the right. She turned around. None of those things protected me. No, Silas said. You are a real thing, she said. This land is a real thing. A marriage certificate is a real legal document that exists in the physical world and that he cannot argue around. She stopped. I am not a woman who marries for convenience. I want you to know that before I say yes. I am not the kind of woman who... She stopped again, and something crossed her face that was complicated and honest and maybe a little undone. I don't know what kind of woman I am anymore, actually. I used to know, and then the last year happened. You're the kind of woman who hauled water buckets in an October night 8 months pregnant to keep a barn from burning, Silas said. I know what kind that is. She looked at him. Yes, she said. All right. Yes. He nodded. I'll ride to the Kellerman settlement tomorrow and find a minister, he said. Unless you want to wait. I don't want to wait, she said, with a directness that made him think she'd been holding that part of the answer longer than the yes. He rode to Kellerman's the next morning and came back with 2 things. A traveling minister named Forsyth who smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and had the pragmatic cheerfulness of a man who had conducted services in barns and open fields and probably stranger places and had stopped requiring ideal circumstances, and the information that a man named Keys Vandermeer, who ran the general store in Kellerman's and had been born in some part of Europe Silas couldn't precisely locate, was willing to come out to the ranch to serve as witness in exchange for Silas settling his account at the store, which he did with the last of his available cash, plus a promissory note against the spring cattle sale. Vandermeer arrived an hour after the minister, on a mule that was slightly too small for him, and that he rode with the philosophical equanimity of a man who had made peace with the inadequacy of his transportation. He was somewhere between 55 and 70, with a gray beard that seemed to operate independently of the rest of his face, and he shook Evelyn's hand and then Silas's hand and looked around the cabin with open approval. Good place, he said, with an accent that bent the vowels in directions English didn't usually go. Solid. I built mine from nothing also. Takes work. It does, Silas agreed. Vandermeer leaned down to look at Hazel, who was standing beside her mother in the good dress that Evelyn had apparently produced from the bag she'd brought from Dry Creek. Silas hadn't known it existed. It was dark blue, with small white buttons, and Hazel wore it with the stiff discomfort of someone dressed for an occasion they hadn't fully agreed to attend. You are the daughter? Vandermeer said to Hazel, very seriously, as if this were important information that required confirmation. Hazel looked at him. Then she gave a single, precise nod. Good, Vandermeer said, equally seriously. A daughter is important. I have 3. They are all terrible and wonderful, and I am very proud. He straightened up and looked at Silas. She does not talk? Not generally, Silas said. This is fine, Vandermeer said. I also did not talk for 2 years when I first came to this country. It passes or it doesn't, and either way the person is still there. He said it to Hazel, not to Silas, and Hazel blinked at him like someone who had been handed a piece of information they weren't sure where to file. The ceremony, such as it was, took 11 minutes. Forsyth did it simply and without embellishment, which Silas appreciated. He said the words that were required. Evelyn said them back. He'd gotten a ring from Vandermeer's store, plain silver, the simplest one in the case, and it went onto her finger with the slightly awkward solemnity of a moment that was real and unceremonious, and both of them knew it. When Forsyth said the part about the marriage being binding under territorial law, Silas heard Evelyn let out a breath. Not relief exactly. More like something she'd been bracing against had just been given a name. Vandermeer clapped once, with great satisfaction, as if something he'd been uncertain about had come out correctly. They ate supper together after, the five of them, Silas, Evelyn, Hazel, Vandermeer, and Forsyth, around the table with the extra crate and a barrel pulled in for seats, and it was loud in a way the cabin hadn't been loud before. Vandermeer had opinions about nearly everything and expressed them freely. Forsyth turned out to know 3 or 4 stories that were considerably more interesting than you'd expect from a minister, and he told them with the timing of a man who had told a lot of stories in a lot of places and had learned what landed and what didn't. Hazel sat at the table and didn't eat as fast as she usually did. She watched Vandermeer and Forsyth with her dark eyes, tracking the conversation, and once when Forsyth said something that was apparently funny enough, the corner of her mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile but was pointed in that direction. Silas filed it away the way he'd been filing things away for weeks. Later, after Vandermeer and Forsyth had gone, Vandermeer back on his insufficient mule into the dark, Forsyth to the settlement 5 miles south where he was staying, Silas sat alone at the table with the marriage certificate in front of him. It was a simple document, signed by both of them and by the witnesses, properly dated and notarized. He looked at it for a while. Evelyn came out of the back room. She'd changed back into the regular dress, the gray one, and she looked tired in the way she always looked tired at the end of a day, but slightly more so. "Thank you," she said, "for today." "Don't thank me," he said. "You're doing me a favor too. This is my land and those are my fences, and I'd rather fight for it with a clear legal position than without one." She looked at the certificate on the table, then at him. "You don't always have to make it practical," she said. He met her eyes. "I know," he said. She went to bed. He sat at the table a while longer. Then he folded the certificate carefully and put it in the inside breast pocket of his coat, which was where he kept the things that mattered. Gideon Mercer arrived on a Thursday morning 17 days after the letter. He arrived the way Evelyn had said he would, in a way that looked correct. 2 wagons on the trail and 4 riders, which was too many for a social call and too few for a frontal attack, perfectly calibrated to say, "This is serious," without saying, "This is violence." The wagons were good ones. The horses were good ones. The men riding alongside were the kind of men who were paid to look competent, and they did. Silas saw them coming from the eastern fence line where he'd been working. He dropped the fence tool and walked back to the ranch at a pace that wasn't running but also wasn't leisurely, and by the time the wagons turned into the track that led to the property, he was standing on the repaired porch step. Evelyn appeared at the cabin door behind him. "Stay inside," he said, without turning around. "No," she said. He wanted to argue and didn't because there wasn't time. She came to stand beside him, one hand resting on the porch post, and her chin was up, and her eyes were steady, and she looked nothing like the woman who had stood on a platform in Dry Creek 7 weeks ago. Or maybe she looked exactly like her, just without the crowd around her, and with a porch under her feet instead. The wagon stopped. The riders stopped. The man who climbed down from the lead wagon was not what Silas had built in his head, which he'd known was probably the case. The men you build in your head were rarely the actual men. Gideon Mercer was somewhere in his late 40s, not physically imposing, medium height, trim in the way. Men were trim who rode a lot and ate carefully. He had the kind of face that would have been unremarkable except for his eyes, which were pale gray and moved over the ranch and the people on the porch with the comprehensive, unhurried assessment of someone who had trained himself to look at everything as a problem to be solved. He was well dressed, not ostentatiously. The clothes were good but practical, chosen to communicate competence rather than wealth, which was its own kind of statement. He walked up the track toward the porch with the easy confidence of a man who did not need to hurry because he was certain of the outcome. He stopped about 10 feet out. "Evelyn," he said. He didn't look at Silas when he said it. "Gideon," she said. Then he looked at Silas, and his eyes did that comprehensive thing. taking in the bandaged hands, the fence tools on the ground where he dropped them, the condition of the barn, the gap where the shed had been. "You'd be Boone," he said. "I would," Silas said. "I have a legal document establishing my family's custodial interest in—" "I've read your lawyer's letter," Silas said. A pause. Gideon's eyes moved to Evelyn and back. "Then you understand the position." "I understand your position," Silas said. "I have a different position." "Your position," Gideon said with the patient precision of a man who is used to correcting misunderstandings, "is that of a man who has interfered with a legal family compact instrument. That's a serious matter in this territory." "It might be," Silas said, "if the instrument were still applicable." Something shifted in Gideon's expression, just slightly. The kind of shift you almost missed if you weren't watching for it. He was watching for it. "What does that mean?" Gideon said. It wasn't quite a question. Silas reached into his coat and took out the certificate. He unfolded it and held it out, not offering it, just making it visible. "It means Evelyn and I were married 9 days ago," he said. "Legally, territorial standard, witnessed and notarized." He paused. "Your compact instrument has a clause. I believe you know the one." The silence that followed was complete. One of the riders shifted in his saddle. The sound of leather creaking was very loud. Gideon Mercer looked at the certificate. He looked at Evelyn. Something moved through his face that was several things at once: disbelief, calculation, anger, and underneath all of it, the specific fury of a man who had been outmaneuvered by a strategy he should have anticipated. "That's not possible," he said. You've been here 7 weeks. 6.5, Silas said. "But we managed." "A marriage entered into under duress wasn't entered into under duress," Silas said. "Entered into in front of a licensed minister and 2 witnesses on a morning when everyone present was clear-headed and in agreement. Your lawyer can challenge it if he wants. He'll need a better argument than 7 weeks." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Evelyn." He said her name directly, turned his full attention to her. "Whatever he's told you—" "He hasn't told me anything," Evelyn said. Her voice was level. "Silas is not a man who tells me things. He's a man who asks me things, which is a distinction you have never understood." "You're 8 months pregnant," Gideon said, and his voice had shifted, gone slightly softer, and Silas recognized that shift. It was the voice of someone who used reasonableness as a tool. "Whatever arrangement you've made here, your baby needs—" "My baby needs to be born somewhere safe," Evelyn said, "which is here, which is what's happening." "The compact is void," Silas said. "You have a ride back north you'd be better off starting." Gideon looked at him. The reasonable voice was gone. What was behind it was not shouting. It was quieter than shouting, which was in some ways worse. "You don't know what you've stepped into," Gideon said. "I know exactly what I stepped into," Silas said. "I did it with my eyes open. That's generally how I do things." A long moment. Gideon's eyes went around the ranch one more time. The barn, the cabin, the fence lines, the mountains behind it all, with that comprehensive, calculating look. He was not a man who acted on impulse. Evelyn had said that, and he could see it. Gideon was revising, regrouping, filing away. "The compact may be voided," Gideon said finally. "That doesn't end the matter." "I know," Silas said. "You're welcome to take whatever other matters you have to your lawyer." Gideon looked at Evelyn one more time. The look was long and complicated and had several things in it that Silas didn't entirely like but that he understood. Gideon had built something in his head about what Evelyn was supposed to be, what she was supposed to do. And the woman standing on this porch was not conforming to that construction. And the gap between the two was producing something in him that was running out of room to be anything other than what it actually was. He turned and walked back to the wagon without another word. He climbed up. The 4 riders and the 2 wagons turned on the track and started back toward the main trail. Silas stood on the porch and didn't move until they were completely out of sight. Then he let out a breath. Beside him, Evelyn was doing the same thing. "That wasn't the end of it," she said. "No," he said. "That was him deciding what the next move is. He said the matter doesn't end." "I heard him." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You were very calm." "Wasn't calm," he said. "Was controlled. Those are different things." She looked at him sideways. "What were you actually feeling?" He thought about it honestly. "Angry," he said. "Watching him look at you like something he misplaced." She held his gaze for a moment. Her expression was difficult to read, which he was learning was what her face did when she was feeling something she wasn't sure yet whether to express. From inside the cabin came a sound. Small feet on the floor, moving fast, and then the door opened and Hazel was there, and she'd clearly been standing at the window watching through the crack because she looked at the empty track where the wagons had been, and then at Silas. Her mouth opened. It was the first time he'd seen her try to speak in the presence of someone other than her mother. The first time he'd seen her actually try, the face she made when she was working up to a word, the slight compression of her lips, and the visible effort of a child fighting through whatever locked the words away. What came out was barely a sound, but it was a word. "Gone?" she said. It came out rough and small and uncertain, like a word that had been unused so long it had forgotten the shape of being spoken. But it was absolutely definitively a word. Evelyn went completely still beside him. Silas looked at Hazel. He kept his face steady, the same steadiness he'd used that first day in the barn with May, the steadiness of not reacting in a way that made the things stop. "Gone," he confirmed. "Yeah." Hazel looked at him. Then she looked at the empty track one more time, and then she went back inside, as matter-of-factly as if she'd asked about the weather. Evelyn put her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were bright. "Don't," Silas said gently. "She'll see, and it'll make it a bigger thing than she's ready for." Evelyn lowered her hand. She breathed in slowly and breathed out. She nodded. "All right," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "All right." But she reached out and briefly touched his arm, just her hand on his forearm, just for a second, before she took it back. And it was the first time she'd touched him voluntarily outside of the practical necessities of bandaging or climbing down from a wagon. He didn't comment on it. He looked out at the mountains. Somewhere to the north, Gideon Mercer was in a wagon revising his plans. That was certain. What was also certain was that the man had just had the legal weapon stripped from his hand and had not taken it gracefully, and a man like Gideon didn't absorb that kind of loss and let it sit. He converted it into something else. Evelyn had told him that from the beginning. What Silas needed now was information. He needed to know what the something else was going to be before it arrived, and he needed to know it in time to prepare for it rather than react to it. He went inside and sat at the table and got out the letter from Briggs, the lawyer in Harrow's Bluff, and read it again. This time he was looking at different things. Not the content, but the structure. The way it was built. What it assumed. What it left out. Evelyn came in and sat across from him and watched him read. "What are you looking for?" she said. "The thing he's most confident about," Silas said. "When a man builds a legal argument, he writes loudest about the things he's certain of and quiet about the things he's not. The land claim," he tapped the third page. He mentions it once, almost in passing. One sentence. A man who was certain about his land claim would have spent a paragraph on it. Evelyn leaned forward and looked at where he was pointing. "He's not certain about the land claim?" she said. "I don't think he is," Silas said, "which means maybe I should be looking at why." He folded the letter. "I need to go to the county seat and look at some records." "That's a 2-day ride." "Yes." She was quiet, and he could see her calculating what 2 days meant. 2 days with just herself and Hazel, with Gideon somewhere regrouping and no telling what he'd decide to do next. "I'll ask Vandermeer," Silas said. "He can come out and stay while I'm gone. He's got a shotgun and he has the disposition of a man who's comfortable using it if necessary." "You trust him?" "He put his name on a document for us with no obligation to do it," Silas said. "That's about as much trust as you can establish in a short time." She considered this. "All right," she said. "Go. Find out what you need to find out." He left the next morning before dawn. He rode hard, and he thought while he rode, and what he thought about was a single sentence in a 4-page letter, almost in passing, the land claim mentioned once and no more. There was a reason for that. He intended to find out what it was. The county seat was a town called Redfield, 2 days hard ride southeast, and Silas made it in a day and a half by starting before dawn and stopping only when the horse needed water. Redfield was bigger than Dry Creek and smaller than it thought it was. The kind of town that had acquired a courthouse and a land registry office and a small hotel and had decided on the basis of these things that it was a serious place. The courthouse was the best-built structure on the main street, which was either a statement of civic pride or a commentary on how much of frontier life ended up requiring legal resolution. Probably both. He arrived late in the afternoon and went directly to the land registry office before it closed, which it was in the process of doing when he pushed through the door. The clerk behind the counter was a thin man in his 50s with the harassed expression of someone who had spent decades being the last obstacle between people and information they wanted and hadn't decided yet whether he resented it or took satisfaction in it. "Closing time," the clerk said. "5 minutes," Silas said. "I'm looking for records on a parcel in the northeastern section of the territory. Family name Mercer. Harrow's Bluff area." The clerk looked at him with the particular assessment of a man who had learned to read urgency and was currently reading his. Whatever he saw apparently cleared some threshold because he sighed and turned back to the shelves. "Mercer," he said, "how far back?" "As far as you have?" The search took closer to 20 minutes than 5. The clerk went through 2 bound ledgers and what appeared to be a supplemental filing box that had been pushed to the back of the lowest shelf and had accumulated a coating of dust that suggested it hadn't been consulted in some years. Silas stood at the counter and waited with the patience of a man who'd spent a day and a half on a horse to get here and was not going to be hurried now that he'd arrived. When the clerk set the documents on the counter, there were 3 of them. 2 were standard land conveyance records, the kind filed when property changed hands. The 3rd was different, older paper, the ink faded to a pale brown at the edges, and when Silas read the header, his hands went still on the counter. It was a relinquishment document, dated 1871, signed by a man named Harlan Mercer, Gideon's father, as best Silas could piece together from the genealogy Evelyn had sketched for him over the preceding weeks, relinquishing all Mercer family claim to a tract of land in the northeastern territory described by survey coordinates that Silas didn't immediately recognize, but that the clerk, when asked, confirmed corresponded to the valley area north of the settlement now known as the Boone Ranch. His ranch. "This is recorded as binding?" Silas asked. "Filed and witnessed," the clerk said, peering at it. "Territorial standard? Relinquishment of this kind is binding on all heirs and successors as of filing date." He paused. "Why? Someone disputing it?" "Might be," Silas said. The clerk looked at the document and then at Silas. "They'd have a hard time of it," he said. "This was filed correctly, witnessed by 2 parties, registered with the territorial office. To challenge it, they'd need to prove fraud or coercion at the time of signing, and given that Harlan Mercer filed it himself personally, that's—" He shook his head. "That's a difficult argument. Can I get a certified copy?" "Cost you $1.50. Silas paid it. He sat in the small hotel that night with the certified copy on the table beside him and the original letter from Briggs and thought about what it meant. Harlan Mercer had relinquished the land claim in 1871, which was 15 years ago, which meant Gideon had known about it his entire adult life. And yet Briggs's letter had mentioned the land claim, that single quiet sentence, as if it were a card to be played if other strategies failed. A bluff. That was what it was. Or something close to it, a claim Gideon knew was legally weak, mentioned almost in passing, held in reserve as a complication, if not an actual weapon. Designed not to win in court necessarily, but to cost money and time and energy to fight, to add another layer to the legal siege Evelyn had described. Now it had no foundation. He lay on the hotel bed that night and stared at the ceiling and thought about Evelyn and Hazel back at the ranch with Vandermeer, who had agreed to come out without much persuading. He'd shown up an hour after Silas asked him, on his inadequate mule, with a shotgun and a bag that appeared to contain primarily food, and had settled into the cabin's main room with the comfortable adaptability of a man who had lived in many places and found most of them acceptable. He thought about Hazel saying "gone" in that small, rusty voice, the word that had come out like something working through a door stuck shut for too long. I thought about the baby that was going to come in 2 or 3 weeks, one way or another, ready or not, whatever situation existed at that point. He rode back the next morning. He was 4 miles from the ranch when he saw the smoke. It was thin and pale against the cold November sky, not the black choking column of the hay shed fire. This was different, controlled, the smoke of a fire that was meant to be burning. He pushed Cooper to a canter and came around the last ridge and saw that the source was a fire built deliberately in the clearing east of the cabin, around which 4 horses were tied, and on the porch of his cabin stood 2 men he didn't recognize. He pulled Cooper to a stop on the ridge and sat there for a moment, reading the situation before he rode into it. The two men on the porch were not doing anything threatening. They were just standing, which was itself a kind of threat. Two men standing on someone else's porch waiting for the owner to return was a statement about who was in charge of the space. There were two more men visible near the barn. And there, sitting on the hitching post near the cabin door with his arms crossed, and the patient expression of a man who had calculated arrival times and was not surprised to see him, was Gideon Mercer. Silas came down the ridge at a walk, controlled. No point in rushing the last 100 yards when the situation was already established. He rode into the yard and stopped and looked at Gideon without getting down. "Where's my wife?" he said. "Inside," Gideon said. Nobody's touched them. I'm not here for that." "Then get off my porch and tell me what you are here for." Gideon uncrossed his arms and stepped down from the hitching post. The two men on the porch stayed where they were. "You've been to the county seat," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd had someone watching, or he'd been very good at predicting. "I have," Silas said. "The relinquishment document," Gideon said. "Yes." Something moved across Gideon's face that was the closest Silas had seen him come to unguarded. It was gone quickly. "My father made that filing under circumstances that were recorded," Silas said. "Filed, witnessed, binding on all heirs and successors. That's what the clerk told me, and that's what it says on the document, and I have a certified copy in my coat right now." Gideon looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the cabin, then back at Silas. "Get down off that horse," Gideon said. "Let's talk like men." "I'm comfortable where I am," Silas said. "Say what you came to say." A pause. Gideon's jaw tightened slightly, the same way it had on that first visit. The micro-expression of a man who had not accounted for the specific texture of the obstacle in front of him. "I'm prepared to drop the land challenge," Gideon said. "The compact is voided by your marriage. The land claim is complicated. I understand that. What I want is a conversation about the child." "Which child?" Silas said flatly. "The one Evelyn is carrying," Gideon said. "That is my brother's child, my family's blood. Whatever legal situation exists between you and Evelyn, that child belongs to its mother," Silas said. "And to me, legally, by virtue of the marriage you can't challenge. Your brother is dead, Gideon. Your claim on his blood ended with him." "That is not how family works," Gideon said, and for the first time there was something in his voice that wasn't strategy, something rawer than strategy. "Thomas was my brother. That baby is the last—" He stopped, reorganized. "You have no idea what you're talking about when it comes to family obligation." "I know what family obligation isn't," Silas said. "It isn't chasing a pregnant woman across a territory. It isn't burning a man's outbuildings. It isn't showing up on someone's land with 4 armed men while that man is away. Whatever you tell yourself that is, it is an obligation." Gideon looked up at him. The pale gray eyes were very cold and very intent. "You want to be careful, Boone." "I know what careful looks like," Silas said. "It doesn't look like this." The cabin door opened. Evelyn came out. Silas moved his eyes to her immediately, checking, assessing, and she met his look with a slight nod that meant she was all right. She came to stand on the porch, one hand resting on the post, and she looked at Gideon with an expression that had absolutely nothing supplicating in it. "I heard," she said to Gideon. "I've been hearing since you rode up." "Evelyn." "No," she said. "I have been listening to you tell me what family means for 2 years, and I have listened as long as I'm going to listen." Her voice was even and final, the voice of a woman who has found the exact thing she was going to say and is saying it without detour. "Thomas's child is going to be born on this land, in this house, with Silas. That's what's happening. You can take your lawyers and your arguments and your men, and you can take them north and find something real to do with your time." A long silence. One of the horses near the fire shifted and the tack jingled. Gideon looked at Evelyn with those gray eyes, and Silas watched the thing that happened in them, the calculation, and underneath the calculation something else, something almost human, the look of a man who was confronting the gap between the world he'd constructed in his head and the world that was actually there. "I'll file the land challenge anyway," Gideon said. His voice had gone quiet in a way that was more alarming than loud would have been. "Even if it doesn't win, it'll take years to resolve. You'll spend everything you have fighting it." "File it," Silas said. Gideon looked at him. "File it," Silas said again. "I have the relinquishment document, and I'll have a lawyer in Redfield file a response within the week. You know you'll lose. You're hoping I don't have the resources to fight long enough to make you lose officially. You're probably right that it'll be expensive." He paused. "File it anyway. I'll figure out the money." Something shifted in Gideon's expression again. The recalculation. "You're willing to spend yourself into the ground for a woman you've known 7 weeks," he said. 8.5, Silas said. "And it's my land she's on, which makes it personal regardless of the woman." "Silas," Evelyn said from the porch, and there was something in the way she said his name, not objecting, just. He looked over at her and her expression was complicated, and he understood that she was telling him to stop using her as a secondary reason when she wasn't. He looked back at Gideon. "She's my wife," he said. "That's the primary reason. The land is second." Gideon looked between them. He looked at the cabin, at the smoke from the east fire, at the mountains behind the ranch. He looked at all of it with those comprehensive, calculating eyes, and this time the calculation took longer than usual. Then he said, "You haven't won this." "I know," Silas said, "but you haven't either." Gideon turned and walked back to his horse. He mounted without hurrying. He looked back at the cabin once, at Evelyn, and it was a long look with things in it that Silas didn't have categories for and wasn't sure he wanted. Then he and his men rode north. Vandermeer appeared in the cabin doorway behind Evelyn, shotgun under his arm, with the relaxed competence of a man who had held one before and would hold one again and was not making a theatrical production of it. "That one," Vandermeer said thoughtfully, watching the riders go. "He will be trouble again." "Yes," Silas said. He climbed down from Cooper and his bad knee complained about the 2 days of riding, and he let it complain, because there wasn't an alternative. "Thank you for being here." "I bring food also," Vandermeer said. "There is a stew. It is good." It was in fact good. Vandermeer's stew was the kind of thing that made you realize a person had fed themselves competently for a long time, which told you something about them that other things didn't. They ate together, the 4 of them, and Silas told Evelyn about the relinquishment document and watched her face as she processed it. The slight widening of her eyes, the thinking, the same rapid assessment she applied to most new information. "He knew about it," she said. "I think so," Silas said. His lawyer knew enough to mention it carefully rather than confidently. "That's why he said it'll take years even if he loses," she said. "He's not trying to win the land case. He's trying to make it too expensive to defend." "Yes. Can you afford a lawyer in Redfield?" He considered the honest answer. "Not comfortably," he said. "But I can sell off part of the eastern grazing lease in spring and cover it." She looked at him with an expression he'd seen before, the one assessing the angle. Then she seemed to let it go, because she'd been around him long enough to know there wasn't one. "I have some money," she said. "Thomas had a small account in a bank in Kellerman's. I couldn't access it while I was running because it would have told Gideon exactly where I was. But I can access it now." "How much?" "Enough to help," she said. "Not enough to solve it, but enough." Vandermeer refilled his bowl and said nothing, which was the right thing. The threat that Gideon had made about the land challenge arrived in the form of a legal filing notice 2 weeks later. It was served by a county official who looked embarrassed about being there and left quickly. Silas read it and put it on the shelf next to the Briggs letter and the certified copy of the relinquishment document, because that was where the things requiring legal responses were accumulating. 2 days after that, there was a story going around the settlement at Kellerman's. He heard about it from Vandermeer, who came out on the mule with supplies and information in equal measure. The story was that Silas Boone had been running stolen cattle through his valley grazing land for 2 years, and that there were men who could testify to it. The story named specific dates. The story had enough specific detail to sound like something other than invention, which was the point. He drove to Kellerman's the next morning and spent 4 hours talking to every person he could find who'd heard the story and tracing it back to its source, which turned out to be a man named Pell, who had arrived in the settlement 3 weeks ago and who nobody knew well, and who had, according to the woman at the post office, been seen talking to 2 men who rode north afterward. He found Pell at the saloon, which was where he found most people at 10 in the morning who needed to be found. Pell was younger than he expected, maybe 30, with the slightly too casual demeanor of someone playing at ease. He looked at Silas coming across the room and tried to decide whether to run or stay, and the decision to stay probably cost him something, but he made it. "I don't know what you think Pell started. "Don't," Silas said. He sat down across from the man. He kept his voice level. I know who you're working for, and I know what you've been saying, and I know why. What I want you to understand is that there is not a person in this settlement who will serve as a credible witness to a cattle theft that didn't happen. Because I've been grazing on that land for 7 years, and everyone who matters in this territory knows my operation. Pell was looking at him carefully. Tell whoever sent you that the story didn't take, Silas said, and that if another one is sent, I'll file a complaint with the Territorial Marshal's office about a coordinated campaign of slander, and I'll name Gideon Mercer specifically, and I'll attach the relinquishment document and the history of this situation, and the Marshal will have a very interesting file to read. He paused. I've been patient about this because I understand what Gideon is doing, and I know most of it won't stick. But the cattle rumor is the kind of thing that affects my livelihood, and that I'm going to push back on with everything I have. A long pause. You seem like you might be smarter than the job you're currently doing, Silas said. That's your business, but carry the message. He stood up and left. Whether the message got carried, he didn't know. What he knew was that the cattle rumor died in Kellerman's within a week, because he spent the week talking to every rancher and farmer and merchant in the area who'd heard it and laying out the truth with the same methodical patience that had served him through 7 years of working land alone. People who'd known him for years weighed what they knew against what they'd heard, and most of them came down on the right side. The ones who didn't, he couldn't help. He came home on a Friday evening in late November to find Evelyn sitting at the table with a sheet of paper in front of her and a pen in her hand and nothing written on the paper yet. She looked up when he came in, and she had an expression he didn't entirely recognize, something that was either exhaustion or decision or both, and he couldn't tell which was primary. What's that? He said, nodding at the paper. I was thinking about writing to Gideon, she said. He hung up his coat. What would you say? I don't know yet, she said. That's the problem. She looked at the blank page. I keep trying to write something that would make him understand, and I can't find the way in because I don't think he can understand it. He looks at me and he sees something he's decided he's entitled to administer, and there isn't a letter I can write that gets behind that. She set the pen down. I think I just wanted to do something that felt like agency, like I was acting instead of waiting. The lawyer in Redfield filed the response to the land challenge yesterday, Silas said. I got word before I left Kellerman's. That's us acting. I know, she said. I know. This is different. She paused. How much is the lawyer costing? Manageable, he said, which was approximately true if you define manageable generously. She looked at him with the look that meant she knew he was being approximately true. I got into the Thomas's account, she said. I transferred what was there to the Kellerman's bank. It's $240. It's not... She stopped. It's not a fortune, but it's real. $240 was, in the current circumstances, extremely real. He didn't say that because she probably knew it. Use it for the lawyer, he said. Half of it, she said firmly. The other half goes toward the spring. We'll need supplies and the cattle sale won't cover everything. He looked at her across the table. She was organizing a shared financial situation with the matter-of-fact practicality of someone who had stopped thinking about herself as separate from the operation. He wasn't sure when that had happened. He suspected it had been happening incrementally, the same way the cabin had changed, gradually, each piece individually unremarkable, the whole only visible when you stepped back. All right, he said. Hazel came out of the back room. She did this now, moved through the cabin with less of the deliberate invisibility she'd brought with her from Dry Creek, no longer making herself small in the corners of rooms. She was still quiet. She would probably always be quiet in the way that some people were constitutionally quiet, the way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the particular shape of a person. But the quality of the quiet had changed. She stopped near the table and looked at the blank page in front of her mother. Nothing on it, Hazel said. Her voice was still rough, still came out in short bursts rather than long sentences, like a mechanism getting relearned. But it was her voice, and it was a sentence. Not yet, Evelyn said. Hazel considered this with the thoughtfulness she applied to most things. Then she picked up the pen from the table, looked at it, and set it back down precisely where she'd found it. Maybe tomorrow, Hazel said. Evelyn looked at her daughter for a moment with an expression that was too full to have a single name. Maybe tomorrow, she said. Hazel went to the window and looked out at the dark, and then went to the barn, because she went to the barn every evening now, because May expected her. The land challenge filing moved slowly through the territorial court system the way that legal proceedings moved, which was to say, with the pace of something that had been designed by people who were paid by the hour rather than the outcome. The lawyer in Redfield, a man named Aldous Pruitt, who had the organized mind of someone who genuinely loved the interior logic of legal documents, wrote Silas a letter every 2 weeks summarizing the current position. The letters were measured and professional and occasionally contained lines like the respondent's counsel appears to be stalling for procedural reasons, which Silas read as this is costing everyone time and money and nobody's winning yet. He could sustain it. The question was for how long and what Gideon would do while it went on. The answer to the second part arrived on the 10th of December, in the form of a visit from a man Silas hadn't met before. Older, not one of Gideon's riders, well-dressed in the specific way of a man who dealt in legitimacy for a living. He knocked on the cabin door at 2 in the afternoon and introduced himself as Everett Crane, a county commissioner from a district 2 settlements north. He had papers. These papers were not from Gideon directly. They were from the county commission, and they challenged not the land claim but the Boone Ranch's water rights on the Eastern Creek, the creek that fed the primary grazing land, without which the summer grazing was effectively worthless. Silas read the papers while Crane stood in the yard and looked at the mountains. The challenge was, as far as he could tell, entirely fabricated. His water rights had been registered at the same time as the land claim, and they were as solid legally as anything he owned. But Crane's commission had filed it anyway, which meant either Crane was genuinely mistaken about the underlying facts or Crane was being paid to file it. "Commissioner," Silas said, "do you know a man named Gideon Mercer?" Crane looked at him. "I know several men in the territory." "That's not what I asked." A pause. "Mr. Mercer has contributed to several civic initiatives in the northern districts," Crane said carefully. "I see," Silas said. He handed the papers back. "My water rights were registered in 1879. I'll have documentation to your office within the week. I'd suggest you look carefully at who's asking you to file challenges before you file them, Commissioner, because a pattern of bad faith filings is the kind of thing that creates problems for the people doing the filing as well as the people being filed against." Crane took the papers. He was not comfortable. "I'm just doing your job," Silas said. "I understand. Do it carefully." After Crane left, Silas went inside and sat at the table and put his head in his hands for about 30 seconds. Just 30 seconds. Then he sat up and started making a list of everything he needed to document and file and respond to, in what order, with what priority. Evelyn watched him from across the room. "He's not going to stop," she said. "No," Silas said. "Every time we close one door, he's going to find another one." She said it without despair. It was too well established a fact to produce despair at this point. "He has more resources than we do and more time." "He has more resources," Silas said. "He doesn't have more time." "Not really." He looked up at her. "He's burning relationships every time he uses someone like Crane for a bad faith filing. Men like Crane don't forget being put in bad positions, and eventually the people Gideon can use start getting fewer." "That takes years," she said. "Yes," he admitted. She was quiet. "Can you hold on for years?" she asked. Not accusingly. She was asking an honest question about an honest resource. He thought about the answer honestly. "I'm on my land," he said. "As long as I'm on my land, I can hold on." She nodded. Then she said quietly, "So can I." It was the middle of December and 3 days before the baby came when Silas found the thing that changed everything. He'd been going through county records. Pruitt had suggested pulling the original Mercer land filings in the territory to build a comprehensive picture of the family's historical claims, the kind of documentation that made bad faith challenges easier to counter. The records had arrived in a bundle from the Redfield clerk's office, most of them routine conveyances and registrations, and he'd been going through them at the table in the evenings while Evelyn rested. He almost missed it. It was in the supplemental filings from 1868, 3 years before the relinquishment document, in a record of a territorial boundary agreement between the Mercer family and a coalition of smaller landowners in the northeastern section. The agreement established the boundaries of Mercer family land claims. It was signed by Harlan Mercer, and it was countersigned, on behalf of the smaller landowners coalition, by a notary who had also served as a territorial land commissioner that year. The notary's name was on the document. The same notary had filed a subsequent document in 1869, a supplemental agreement that, and this was the thing that made Silas sit very still with the paper in his hands, explicitly acknowledged that the northeastern valley land, the land his ranch now sat on, had never been legitimately part of the Mercer claim and had been surveyed in error in an earlier filing. The 1871 relinquishment document hadn't been Harlan Mercer voluntarily giving up a valid claim. It had been Harlan Mercer acknowledging in writing what the 1869 supplemental document had already established, that the claim had never been valid to begin with. Gideon knew this. He had to know this. The relinquishment wasn't a concession. It was a legal cleanup of a boundary error that Harlan Mercer had been pressured into acknowledging. And Gideon had filed the land challenge anyway, knowing full well that not only would he lose, but that the history of the filing showed his family had known they had no valid claim since 1869. That was not just losing a land challenge. That was documented bad faith, the kind that Pruitt could put in front of a territorial judge with the pattern of the water rights challenge and the slander campaign and the filings through Commissioner Crane, and build a picture that was considerably more damaging than any individual piece. Silas sat at the table and looked at the 1869 document for a long time. Then he looked up. The lamp was burning, and outside it was December cold, and somewhere in the back room Evelyn was resting, and Hazel was almost certainly in the barn, saying goodnight to May the way she did every night, because she did it every night without being asked, because somewhere in the past 2 months the barn had become hers, in the way that things become yours when they let you be yourself around them. He heard, faintly, the sound of Evelyn moving in the back room, and then a different sound, a sharp intake of breath, the kind that wasn't voluntary. He was up before the sound finished. He knocked once on the door and opened it. Evelyn was sitting on the edge of the bed with both hands pressed flat on the mattress on either side of her, and her face was very white, and her jaw was set in the way he'd seen it set when she was working through something she intended to get through by force of will. She looked up at him. "It's time," she said. Outside, the December wind hit the cabin walls hard enough to rattle the window in the east frame. The one that still had the small crack he'd been meaning to fix, the crack that Evelyn had covered with cloth in the first week, the cloth that was still there, doing its job. He sat down on the edge of the bed across from her and took both her hands in his bandaged ones. The burns had healed, but the skin was still tight. And he looked at her directly. "All right," he said, "tell me what you need." She looked at him with those dark, direct eyes, and he could see the pain moving through her in waves, the way she breathed through each one and came back up between them. "I need you to not panic," she said. "I'm not going to panic," he said. "And I need Hazel out of the barn and inside," she said. "She shouldn't be alone out there." "I'll get her in a minute," he said. "First tell me what I need to know." She told him. She told him practically and precisely, the way she did everything, even now, even through the tightening and releasing of a body doing the most demanding work it had ever done. She told him what had happened before with Hazel's birth, what had been difficult and what had been manageable, what he needed to watch for, and what was normal even when it didn't look it. He listened with his full attention and didn't flinch at any of it. "I did this without a doctor last time too," she said, between two contractions. "On my own, that was worse." "You're not on your own this time," he said. She looked at him, and something in her face shifted in a way that was different from anything he'd seen before. Not the assessing look, not the direct look, not the look that was searching for the angle. Something underneath all of those looks. The thing those looks had been standing in front of. "No," she said. "I'm not." He went and got Hazel from the barn. Hazel came in from the barn without argument, which told him she already knew something was different. Children who had lived close to crisis developed that particular sensitivity, the ability to read the air of a room before anyone said a word. She came through the cabin door and looked at him and looked at the closed door of the back room and then looked at him again. "Your mama's having the baby tonight," he said. Hazel absorbed this. "Is she okay?" "She's going to be okay," he said. "It's hard work, but she's done it before and she knows what she's doing." He crouched down to her level. "I need you to stay out here, and I need you to be the steadiest person in this room. Can you do that?" Hazel looked at the closed door, then at him. She gave one precise nod. "Good," he said. He went back to Evelyn. What followed was the longest night Silas Boone had spent since the night 7 years ago, when he'd come home to find the fever had taken everything he had, and that comparison was not something he made lightly. The difference was that this night had work in it, concrete, immediate, demanding work that didn't allow space for anything except the next necessary thing, which he understood in some part of himself was a mercy. Evelyn was not a quiet sufferer. She wasn't loud either. It wasn't that. She was focused, intensely and almost frighteningly focused, the way a person got focused when every resource they had was directed at a single task, and there was nothing left over for anything peripheral. She told him what she needed when she needed it, short, clear sentences, no extra words. He did what she told him. When she told him to get more water, he got it. When she told him what to prepare, he prepared it. When she reached for something to grip, he gave her his hand, and she took it with the full strength of a woman who had long since stopped moderating herself around him, which he registered somewhere under the immediate urgency of the situation. At some point in the small hours, he had no clear sense of time. The lamp was burning, and the wind outside had gone from rattling the windows to a low, steady push against the walls. He heard the door open slightly and looked back to see a strip of Hazel's face in the gap. Just her eyes, watching. "It's all right," he said. "Go back to the table." The door closed. The baby came just before dawn. He'd been told what to do, and he did it, and there was a moment, a specific, particular moment, that he was never going to be able to describe adequately to anyone who asked him about it, when he was holding something that had not existed in the world 30 seconds ago. 8 pounds of new person, slick and furious and absolutely committed to announcing her arrival to anyone within earshot. She screamed the way the newly born screamed, with the pure, undiluted outrage of something that has just discovered that the world is cold and loud and considerably different from where it had been before. He had held a newborn once before. His son, 22 years ago, in a different life. He remembered the weight of it. He had not thought about how much he remembered until this moment, and the memory arrived without warning and hit him somewhere central and undefended. He took a breath. He did what needed doing. He put the baby in Evelyn's arms and sat back and looked at the lamp on the shelf and waited for whatever was moving through his chest to finish moving. "She's healthy," Evelyn said. Her voice was wrecked and exhausted and entirely certain. "She sounds healthy." "She does," he agreed. That was an understatement. The baby's opinion of her situation was being communicated at considerable volume and with impressive consistency. Evelyn looked at him over the baby's head. Her hair was everywhere and her face was gray with exhaustion, and she was looking at him with an expression that was too tired to be complicated, and so was just direct. Unguarded in the way that people got unguarded when they'd used up everything they had and didn't have anything left to put up as a front. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said, same as the first time in Dry Creek. She almost smiled. "I know you don't like it," she said. "I'm saying it anyway." The door opened. He hadn't heard Hazel get up from the table, but she was there in the doorway, and her eyes went immediately to her mother and then to the bundle in her mother's arms. Her face did something he'd never seen it do before, but went completely open, every careful layer of it, the watchfulness and the wariness and the practiced invisibility, all of it gone, replaced by something that was just a child looking at a baby. "Come here," Evelyn said. Hazel came to the bed and looked at her sister. "She's small," Hazel said. "She'll get bigger," Evelyn said. Hazel reached out one finger and touched the baby's hand, and the baby's hand, in the way that newborn hands did, reflexively, automatically, closed around it. Hazel went very still. She looked at that tiny fist wrapped around her finger with an expression that was past describing. Silas got up and went out to the main room and sat at the table and put both hands flat on the surface and breathed. He sat there for a while. The lamp in the back room sent a strip of light under the door, and he could hear Evelyn's voice low and continuous, talking to both of her daughters, and the baby's intermittent outrage gradually softening to the sounds of a new person beginning to take inventory of the world in a less hostile way. He looked at the 1869 document still on the table where he'd left it. He thought about Gideon Mercer. He thought about what the document meant legally, what Pruitt could do with it, what the pattern of bad faith filings looked like assembled together. He thought about Commissioner Crane's uncomfortable face and Harold Fitch in the crowd in Dry Creek, and the two riders on the ridge, and the black square of ash where the hay shed had been. Then he stopped thinking about Gideon Mercer because there was a baby in the next room and he was tired, and Gideon could wait until morning. He named her Clara. That was Evelyn's decision, made on the second day, and she said it with the certainty of someone who had been holding the name in reserve for a while. Clara. It was a good name, simple and clear, the kind of name that didn't require anything extra to work. Silas wrote to Pruitt on the fourth day and enclosed a copy of the 1869 document and explained what he'd found and what he believed it meant in the context of the existing land challenge and the pattern of subsequent filings. He wrote it out carefully, taking his time, because the argument needed to be laid out sequentially and without gaps. Pruitt's response arrived 10 days later and was the most uncharacteristically direct letter Silas had received from him. "This changes the picture considerably," Pruitt wrote. The 1869 supplemental acknowledgement establishes not only that the Mercer family had no valid claim on the northeastern valley land, but that a senior Mercer, your opponent's father, formally acknowledged this in a witness document 16 years ago. The subsequent land challenge filed by Gideon Mercer, combined with the water rights challenge and the documented pattern of third-party interference, presents a case for bad faith litigation that I believe a territorial judge would find compelling. I am filing a motion to consolidate the land and water challenges and request dismissal with prejudice, and I intend to attach a full accounting of the interference pattern to the filing. This will be a matter of public record. He read the letter twice. Then he handed it to Evelyn, who was nursing Clara at the table with the particular focused calm of a woman learning the rhythms of a new person, and watched her read it. She looked up when she finished. "With prejudice," she said. "Means it can't be refiled," Silas said. She was quiet for a moment. "And the public record part?" "Means anyone who wants to can read what Gideon has been doing," he said. Evelyn looked at Clara. She looked at Hazel, who was at the window with May's grain bucket, about to go out for the morning feeding. She looked at the cabin around her, the cloth over the east window, the rocks in a line on the sill, the two chairs and the crate, and the barrel that made a table for four. "Okay," she said. It was a small word. It had a lot in it. He sent the letter back to Pruitt with authorization to proceed. What happened next took 3 weeks, and most of those 3 weeks were quiet, in a way that felt provisional. The quiet of something waiting to resolve rather than the quiet of something settled. Silas kept working the ranch, kept going over the documentation with Pruitt's guidance, kept his eye on the northern ridgeline out of habit, even when no riders appeared on it. Clara turned 2 weeks old and figured out that being awake was something she could do at any hour, which she practiced with enthusiasm. Silas learned to sleep in shorter intervals and developed the particular skill of waking fully and immediately that he hadn't needed since his army years. Evelyn did the same, and they crossed paths in the small hours sometimes, him coming in from the cold and her up with the baby, and they talked in the low voices people used when there was a child asleep in the other room. Practical, quiet, close to honest in the way that the middle of the night made conversations honest. One night she said, out of nothing in particular, "Are you sorry?" He looked at her. "For what specifically?" "For stopping in Dry Creek," she said. "For the wheel, all of it." He thought about it. He gave it the honest consideration the question deserved rather than the easy answer. "No," he said. "It's been complicated," she said. "Most things worth doing are complicated," he said. "If it were simple, it probably wouldn't need doing." She looked at Clara, who was temporarily and improbably asleep against her shoulder. "I think about that platform sometimes," she said. "What would have happened if the wheel hadn't broken? If you'd gone around Dry Creek instead of through it?" "I don't," he said. She looked at him. "Can't think about the version where things went differently," he said. "Doesn't help anything, and it's not what happened. That's a very practical way to look at it. I'm a practical man." "You are," she said. "Sometimes too practical. Sometimes it's a wall you stand behind." He considered that. "Maybe," he said. She shifted Clara slightly and looked at him across the lamp. "What was your wife's name?" He hadn't expected the question, not because it was wrong to ask, it wasn't, but because he'd gotten so practiced at not being asked that the asking arrived like a door opening in a wall. He'd stopped noticing was a wall. "Margaret," he said. "And your son?" "Daniel." He paused. He was 4 months old. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said, the same way she'd said it the first time, early on, without making it more than it was. "I know," he said. They sat in the quiet for a while after that, not filling it, because neither of them was a person who felt compelled to fill quiet, and the baby breathed on Evelyn's shoulder with the complete absorption in the act of breathing that new people had, and outside the December wind had dropped to something almost gentle. Pruitt's filing went into the territorial court on a Thursday in January. By the following Tuesday, word had come back that the opposing counsel, Briggs, Gideon's lawyer, had filed a response that Pruitt described in his letter as thin. The week after that, Silas got a message from Pruitt that the judge had requested a preliminary hearing, which Pruitt called encouraging news. Then, on a Wednesday morning that was clear and cold, with ice on the water trough that Silas broke with a hammer before the morning feeding, a rider came down the North Trail. One rider. Not four, not two wagons, one man, on a good horse, riding at a walk. Silas was at the fence line with a post driver when he saw him coming. He set the post driver down and stood and watched. The rider was Gideon Mercer, alone. That was new enough that Silas didn't move immediately, just watched him come down the trail and turn into the property track and ride up to within 30 feet of him and stop. Gideon looked different. Not in any specific dramatic way. Same coat, same composed face, same pale gray eyes. But something in the composition of him was altered. The certainty that had always sat on him like a well-fitted garment was slightly off. Not gone, not broken, but aware of itself in a way it hadn't been before. "Boone," he said. "Mercer," Silas said, a pause. "I heard from Briggs," Gideon said, "about the 1869 document. I assumed you would. He says the motion to dismiss is likely to be granted." "That's what my lawyer thinks too," Silas said. Gideon looked at the fence line, at the ranch behind Silas, at the mountains. He looked at all of it with the assessing eyes, but the assessment had a different quality now. It wasn't the look of a man calculating how to take something. It was the look of a man calculating how to explain something to himself. "I didn't come to argue the case," Gideon said. Silas waited. "I came—" Gideon stopped, started over, and the starting over cost him something, which Silas could see. "My brother is dead. Thomas is dead. And the child Evelyn is carrying," he corrected himself, "the child she had. Clara. That child is the last direct connection I have to my brother." "I know that," Silas said. "I have managed things badly," Gideon said. He said it the way a man said a thing he'd come to say, even though saying it was the hardest part of the trip. Not as an apology exactly. As a fact he'd finally admitted to himself and was now being required to admit out loud. "Yes," Silas said. "You have." "I don't—" Gideon paused. "I don't know how to do this without the structure I have, the legal structure, the way I've always handled things. It's all I know how to use." "I noticed," Silas said. "I want to know my niece," Gideon said. Flat, direct, stripped of the careful language. "I am not asking for the compact or the land or anything that has to do with what I—" He stopped. "I know those are gone. I know I burned them. I want to know Clara. I wanted to know if there is any version of that which is possible." Silas looked at him for a long moment. He thought about what Evelyn had told him, in pieces, over the months. About Gideon, yes. The control, the machinery of legal siege, the bad faith. But also the few things that had come through in unguarded moments, the things that made him human rather than just an obstacle. The way he'd been when Thomas was young, before their father died and the weight of the family land fell on him. The way he'd shown up at Thomas's deathbed, which Evelyn had not omitted when she told the story, even though it complicated the picture. Silas was not a man who simplified people when the complicated version was the true one. "That's not my decision," he said. Gideon looked at him. "Evelyn won't—" "I didn't say she won't," Silas said. "I said it's not my decision. It's hers." A pause. "She won't talk to me," Gideon said. "You chased her across a territory and burned my outbuilding and filed 3 bad faith legal actions," Silas said. "She needs time. What she needs doesn't run on your timeline." Gideon was quiet. "If I were advising you," Silas said, "which I'm not, because you haven't asked, and I don't generally give advice to men who've been trying to take my land, I'd say withdraw the remaining filings before the court dismisses them. Let it be your choice rather than the judge's, And then wait. Don't write. Don't send lawyers. Just wait. For how long? Until she's ready, Silas said. Which might be a long time, which might be never. That's the consequence of the choices you made. Gideon looked at the ground. Something moved through his face that Silas didn't look at too closely, because it was private in the way that a man's reckoning with himself was private. All right, Gideon. He turned his horse. Mercer, Silas said. Gideon stopped. Thomas was lucky to have someone who loved him that much, Silas said. Whatever you did with it after he was gone, the loving him was real. I could see that even when everything else was wrong. Gideon sat on his horse and didn't say anything. Then he rode north, alone, at the same deliberate walk he'd arrived at. Silas watched him go. Then he picked up the post driver and went back to work, because the fence wasn't going to fix itself. That evening he told Evelyn. He told her all of it. What Gideon had said, what he'd said back, what he'd seen in Gideon's face. He didn't editorialize. He just told her what had happened and let it be what it was. Evelyn was nursing Clara when he told her. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a while. He withdrew the filings? She said. Pruitt sent word this afternoon, Silas said. All of them, filed voluntarily before close of business. She looked at Clara. She looked at the window, at the dark outside. I don't forgive him, she said. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. I know, Silas said. But Clara is going to grow up and she's going to have questions about her father's family, she said. And I don't want to be the person who made those answers impossible. She paused. I'm not ready to talk to him, but I'm not going to say never. Silas nodded. You told him it wasn't your decision, she said. It wasn't. She looked at him. Most men in your position would have made it their decision. I'm aware, he said. Is that something you decided or something you just are? He thought about it. Both, I think, he said. I decided to be it because it seemed right, and then I think it became what I actually am. He paused. Or maybe it was always what I was, and I just stopped practicing it for a while. She held his gaze for a moment longer than usual. Then she looked back at Clara. Silas, she said. Yeah. I need to tell you something. All right. She shifted Clara to her other arm and straightened up slightly, the way she did when she was organizing what she was going to say. But this time there was something different about the pause. It was less like organizing and more like standing at an edge and looking down at it. I know what this started as, she said. What I mean is, I know the practical reasons. I know we were two people in a bad situation and we made a sensible decision together. She wasn't looking at him now, looking at the lamp instead, which was what she did when she was being more honest than she was entirely comfortable being. But I also know that somewhere in the last few months, I stopped thinking about it as a practical arrangement. The cabin was very quiet. I noticed, he said. She looked at him sharply. When? The night of the fire, he said. When you touched my arm. After Hazel spoke. She considered that. That was months ago. Yes, he said. And you didn't say anything. I was waiting for you to say something, he said. You do better when you come to things on your own timeline. I've noticed that too. She looked at him for a long time. The lamp flickered slightly, the way lamps did when there was a draft. And in the moving light, her face was very clear, tired, because she was always tired these days, but clear under the tired, the way things were clear when they'd made it through the unclear part. I'm saying something now, she said. I know, he said. Well? He got up from his chair. He crossed the 4 feet of cabin floor between them and crouched in front of her and looked at her straight on, at eye level, the way he'd crouched in front of Hazel that first day with the wagon. I stopped thinking of it as a practical arrangement about a week after you got here, he said. Closer to 3 weeks if I'm being completely accurate. He paused. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to be one more person putting pressure on you towards something you might not want. She blinked. 3 weeks, she said. When you fixed the east window, he said, with the cloth. I came in from the barn and the draft was gone, and you were just standing there like it was a small thing, and I thought... He stopped. I thought this is what a house is supposed to feel like. I thought I'd forgotten. Clara made a small sound between sleeping and waking. Evelyn reached out and touched his face with her free hand, just her palm against his cheek, briefly, the same kind of brief touch she'd given his arm that night after Hazel spoke. But this time she didn't take it back. She left it there, and he covered it with his hand, the hand that still had the faint pink ridges of healed burns across the palm. "All right," she said, quietly, completely. It was the same 2 words she'd said when he'd proposed, but different now. The first time had been a decision. This time it was just true. The land challenge was formally dismissed with prejudice in February, the judge's written ruling 19 pages that Pruitt summarized in 2 sentences. The Mercer family claim is found to have no legal basis and to have been pursued in bad faith, and costs are assessed against the respondent. The water rights challenge had already been withdrawn. Commissioner Crane sent a stiffly formal letter to Silas acknowledging the resolution of the matter, which Silas read and filed and never responded to because there was nothing useful to say. Pruitt's final bill arrived in March and was significant but manageable, paid out of the spring cattle sale and Thomas's bank account in roughly equal parts. The eastern grazing lease held its value through winter better than he'd expected, and the herd came through the cold months in decent shape, losing 2 to illness and none to weather, which was better than most years. Life on the ranch did not become simple. It never had been simple, and the addition of a marriage and 2 children and a resolved legal siege did not make it simple, because that was not how ranching worked, or how families worked, or how anything worked. The roof on the east side of the barn finally demanded proper attention in April and cost him 2 weeks of labor and more money than he had comfortable to spend. May developed a respiratory condition in spring that required a veterinarian from Kellerman's and a course of treatment that Hazel supervised with the intensity of someone conducting a critical operation, sitting with the horse for hours, monitoring, reporting back to Silas with the grave precision of a child who had decided this was her responsibility. May recovered. Hazel took full credit, which was not entirely inaccurate. Clara grew in the way babies grew, not gradually but in sudden jumps, so that you'd look up and she'd be doing something she hadn't been doing last week. Looking at something with new comprehension, reaching for things, making sounds that were moving toward language in a trajectory Silas found completely absorbing in a way he hadn't anticipated and didn't try to explain to himself. He just watched and paid attention and got up in the night when Evelyn couldn't get there first, which she noticed and didn't comment on directly, but incorporated into the way she looked at him, the way her expression had changed over the months into something that had no wariness in it. Hazel talked more. Not a lot. She was still Hazel, still constitutionally quiet, still most comfortable with animals and with silence and with sitting at the window watching things. But she talked. She asked questions now, which was new, the particular questions of a child catching up on the years she'd kept them to herself. Some of the questions were for Evelyn. Some were for Vandermeer, who came out every few weeks and had become something unofficial in their lives. Not family exactly, something that didn't have a ready category but was real regardless. And some of the questions were for Silas, asked in the direct, assessing way she had, watching his face while he answered to see if the answer matched what she already suspected. One afternoon in early May, a good afternoon, the kind where the mountains looked close enough to touch and the air had finally lost the last of winter, Hazel found him at the fence and stood beside him watching him work for a while without saying anything. He let the silence be what it was, because he'd learned that Hazel's silences were working silences, productive in a way that didn't show on the outside. Then she said, "Papa." He went still. It was the first time. Not as a question, not as a test, just a word said in the matter-of-fact tone of a 7-year-old stating a category she'd decided was accurate. He looked at her. She was looking at the fence, not at him, in the way she sometimes delivered important things sideways, like she'd rather you received them than watched you receive them. "Yeah," he said. She nodded once, precisely, the same nod she'd given Vandermeer when he'd asked if she was the daughter. The nod that meant this is established, this is agreed upon, we can proceed. She went back to the barn. He stood at the fence for a while after she left, not working, just standing, his hands on the top post and his eyes on the mountains, and the feeling in his chest, something he had no category for and wasn't going to try to name, because some things were more themselves unnamed. Evelyn was at the fence by evening, Clara on her hip, come to tell him supper was close to ready. She looked at his face when she reached him and read something in it, the way she read most things. "What happened?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Good thing." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she looked at the mountains the way he'd been looking at them. You know, she said, I spent a long time thinking that the hard part was surviving. Just getting through. Getting Hazel somewhere safe, getting myself somewhere safe, keeping going until things got better. She shifted Clara on her hip. I didn't leave room to think about what better actually looked like. What does it look like, Yus? He said. She looked around. The ranch, the barn, the smoke from the cabin chimney, the mountains. This, she said. More or less. More or less, he agreed. She leaned against him slightly, her shoulder against his arm, the way you leaned against something solid when you'd been standing up on your own for a long time, and the standing up had gotten heavy. He didn't move. He just was there, which was the thing she needed him to be. Clara reached up and grabbed a fistful of his shirt. She does that now, Evelyn said. Grabs things. I noticed. She grabbed Hazel's braid this morning. Hazel was very patient about it. Hazel's patient about most things. She gets it from you, Evelyn said. The patience. He looked down at Clara, who was investigating his shirt collar with the complete concentration of a person for whom a shirt collar was a profound subject. Maybe, he said, or she just always had it. They stood at the fence in the May evening while the light went gold across the mountains, and then pink, and then the particular shade of pale that came just before dark. Clara fell asleep against Evelyn's shoulder with the efficiency of a baby who had decided the day was complete. Hazel's lamp came on in the barn. She'd asked for her own lamp 2 weeks ago, for the evening she spent with May, and they'd given it to her with the understanding that she knew how to handle it, which she did. From somewhere north, over the ridge that had carried 2 silent riders in October and Gideon Mercer's lone horse in January, came nothing. Just the wind and the sound of the last birds of the day, and the particular piece of a place where the thing that had been coming had come and gone, and the land had absorbed it the way land absorbed most things, completely, without ceremony, leaving no more trace than the grass needed time to cover. Silas thought about a broken wagon wheel. He thought about the specific dumb luck of it, the crack that had been there for weeks probably, running its quiet length through the wood, waiting for the right moment to announce itself. The way he'd cursed it when he'd noticed the wobble 3 miles before Dry Creek. The way he'd thought, turning off the main trail into that particular settlement on that particular morning, this is a setback. He'd been wrong about that. He was wrong about some things. He knew that about himself, that he closed off sometimes, that he went practical when he was avoiding something real, that the wall Evelyn had named on a late night over the baby was real and had been there a long time and came down slowly. He was not an easy man to know. He'd been alone long enough that he'd developed the habits of aloneness, the self-sufficiency that could read as distance, the quietness that could look like absence when it wasn't. Evelyn was not an easy woman to know either. She was still sometimes too quick to prepare for the thing to go wrong, still flinched occasionally at a raised voice or a sudden sound, some reflex from 8 months of running that wasn't going to dissolve in a season. She had opinions that she'd stopped moderating and that were sometimes inconvenient. She organized things without asking because she'd had to be in charge of everything for so long that delegating required conscious effort. She was working on it. They both were. That was the thing nobody told you about families, Silas thought. Not the ones you were born into, and not the ones you made. They didn't arrive finished. They arrived as raw material, and you worked them, same as land, slowly, imperfectly, with a lot of mornings that didn't go the way you planned. Building something that wouldn't look like much if you looked at any single day, but that looked like something real if you stood back at the end of a year and measured the distance from where you started. He'd started broke and alone with a broken wheel and $4 in his pocket. He'd ended the year with a wife who had stopped searching his face for the angle, a daughter who had just called him Papa like it was a settled fact, and a baby asleep on his wife's shoulder who had grabbed his shirt collar with the full confidence of a person who expected to be held. He wasn't going to say it was simple. He wasn't going to say everything was resolved and the hard parts were behind them, because he was 41 years old and he knew better than that. There would be hard parts. There would be bad winters and lean years and moments when the weight of what they were carrying was more than either of them was sure they could hold. Gideon Mercer had gone quiet, not gone, and quiet and gone were different things. The ranch would demand more than they had to give, probably more than once, but the hard parts would be theirs. That was the thing. Whatever came next would belong to the 4 of them. to Silas and Evelyn and Hazel and Clara, to be handled or mishandled or handled just well enough together on their own land, in their own time. That was all a family was, when you stripped it down to the actual thing, not the idea of it, not the version you told people. The actual thing, which was just people who had decided to be each other's problem and meant it. The light finished going. The stars came up the way they came up out here, with the unsettling abundance of a sky that had no competition. Not one or two, but thousands. The kind of sky that made a person feel small and located at the same time. "Come inside," Evelyn said. "It's cold." "In a minute," he said. She went in. He stood at the fence one more minute, the way he always stood one more minute, looking at the mountains in the dark and the stars above them and the lit windows of the cabin below, and he let it be what it was. Then he turned